Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Shevuot Afav. This week's learning is sponsored by Audrey Mondro in memory of Bessie Nanny Moskoff, Bashalea Bat Sivya Chaya and Mary Yehuda, a very special mother. By example, she taught me how to be a mother and grandmother. We miss her dearly. May Hanashama have an Aliyah. Okay, we're going to get started with today's stuff. We finished off about the baheret, and we were talking about the baheret and the seit, and I'll just review. In the Mishnah lined up things as avot and toladot. There's baheret, and there's the seed aichal, which is a toladah, and also a leprous mark, which is similar to baheret. Then we have seit, which is a little darker than baheret, and then we have a toladah of that, which is the chrome of the beitzah, right, the membrane of the egg. So these are all different shades of white, okay? And the order that they go in terms of light to dark, is baheret, then seit, the two avot, and then the two toladot, which is the seed and the chrome habeitzah. So we talked about that the Mishnah clearly doesn't follow Rabbi Akiva, because the Mishnah lines it up. Okay, and we'll call them again. It was a little easier. We can call them in two different ways. I think it'll help. There's A, which is the first toladah, and the first av, which is the baheret, and A1, which is the toladah of that. And that's how the Mishnah organized. A1, B, which is seit, and the toladah of seit, which is B2, okay, which is the chrome habeitzah, the membrane. So we have is this setup. And basically the way they understood this setup to be, Rabbi Hanina, who basically says, wait a minute, who does this Mishnah accord with? It seems to not really accord with Rabbi Akiva. And that's because the Mishnah sets it up as if there's two categories, and A1 goes with A and B1 goes with B. And therefore those are the ones that can join together when it comes to saying, do you have a leprous mark? Is it big enough? Well, if you have this color and that color together, they'll go together if it's the av and the toladah. The A with A1, yes, it'll join together. If it's A and B, or A and B1, or something like that, it won't go together. Rabbi Akiva said that zolam alamizel and zolam alamizel, it goes in order of light to dark. So, imagine one of those color wheels of, colors in for paint, let's say, for example. So you have, these swatches of color for different things. So it goes from baheret, seit, seed, and chrome. So you end up with, right? You can call them 1, 2, 3, 4, but it's easier to understand it better if you say A, B, A1, B1. Okay, that's Rabbi Akiva's order. Now that's not the order in the Mishnah. So basically, Rabbi Hanina says it seems clear that Rabbi Akiva doesn't match our Mishnah, because in the order of A, B, A1, B1, 1, 2, 3, 4. One can go with two can go with three, two can go with one, right? All those can combine 3 and 4, right? But notice which combines. A with B, B with A1, and A1 with B1, okay? But A and A1 don't go together, and B and B1 don't go together, okay? But the Gemara really said, okay, and this is where we ended, Ihachi, right, we're going to have a problem with what? If we really held like Rabbi Akiva, chrome beitzah, we're going to say the seed has nothing to combine with, right? But they said it's not just the seed. There's nothing to combine with. It's also the chrome habeitzah. It's also the last one. The last one has nothing to combine with. In other words, right? Because again, it can't combine with, neither of them can combine with something next to them because it's not the toladah. So, the assumption is it also needs to combine with what's next to it. And if it held like the Mishnah, it would also combine the av and the toladah. It would need that to work. And those two can't go together. So then the Gemara said, but wait, and this is where we ended. It should also be a problem, right? The issue should be also not just that issue, but it should also be the chrome beitzah, because that also has nothing to combine with. B1 is at the very bottom. The only thing close to it is A1. Can't combine with A1 either. So, and it can't combine with B because B is 2 steps away. So why did they only ask the question that way? And that's where our Gemara starts. Hi, man. Why is that even a question? Because there's a separate reason that's going to explain why the chrome beitzah can actually connect with seit, even according to Rabbi Akiva, and even though they're one step away from each other, right? There's something in the middle. Bishlama below seed hecha, chrome beitzah lo kasha. If it weren't for Sida Ichal being a problem, we wouldn't actually be able to question from Krum Beitza. Why not? Even though it's 2 away from Se'ed, because Se'ed is B, A, B, and Krum Beitza is B1, and before you get to B1, there's A1, according to Rabbi Akiva. Well, Rahmana Amar, there's a special drasha in the Torah. The Torah said, V'laset v'lasapachat. Right? We read that last week. Aset v'lasapachat, meaning, okay, what's the sapachat? Sapachat tefillah laset. Sapachat is what's annexed to it, right? An annex, an added. So the sapachat is the toladot. What do we learn here? Because it says laset v'lasapachat, we're going to learn that set can go with its sapachat even if it's 2 away. Okay? Tefillah, so again, sapachat tefillah laset. Afagav demenachat aminei tuva, even if it's separate from it, right? There's something in between, which would be the seed. But ela seed echal kasha, but seed echal is toladot baheret, not of se'ed, and therefore, what are you going to say? Ela mechuvrata matnitin delo Rabbi Akiva. So it really must be that our Mishna doesn't match Rabbi Akiva, because again, our Mishna seems to say av with toladot, and even though the krom beitzah could go with its av because of the special drasha in the pasuk, you can't say the same for the seed. Now, what we want to figure out, and the Gemara is going to struggle with this, is what is the source for the fact that Rabbi Akiva holds this way? So we're going to start with one. It's going to be introduced with an ilema, which means if you say, and then we're going to reject that. Ilema mehadetanya, if it comes from this Braita, let's read it. Amar Rabbi Yossi, Sha'al Yoshua b'dal shel Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, the son of Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yoshua. Many people think that this is the famous Yoshua ben Korcha, and that Rabbi Akiva was bald, and that's why Kereach means bald. Yoshua ben Korcha was called Yoshua, the son of the bald one. Just a little disrespectful to Rabbi Akiva, but some people claim that's his son. Anyway, he had a son named Rabbi Yoshua, and his son says to him, Why did the Mishnah say 2 that are 4? And counted them, with their names, right? The baheret with its toladot and the se'ed with its toladot. So Amar lo, vim lav mayomru. What else should the Mishnah have said? Okay, Rabbi Akiva is really prodding him to say, what's really bothering you? Yomru, so his son says, they should have said, mikrom be'etzalumala tamei. Mikrum be'etzalumala tamei. Should have said, the whole thing is, all these shades from very white to a little more muddled white, not exactly clear white, until you get down to krum beitzah, which is the least white of all of them. It should have just said anything, like we talked about a color wheel, anything from this shade and lighter is a negat, right, is a leprous mark. So why didn't it just say that? Amar lo, so Rabbi Akiva said, what's the reason why it specifically said that we have baheret with its toladot, the seed, and we have the se'ed with its toladot, which is the krum. So Amarlo, the reason why we did this is to teach you shemitzdarfim zeim zeh. The whole thing was to teach you that they can join together the toladot with the av. So, and they go in this particular, in other words, they wanted you to know, they didn't just say mikrum beitzah, because they wanted you to know that it goes in order of light to dark. And that's how they combine. This is Rabbi Akiva, right? This is what he's saying. So Amarlo, v'yomru, but then Rabbi Yeshua's son says, why didn't they just say that? If they wanted to teach you mitzdarfim, and they want to teach you that the least darkest shade, the least white shade that you can still say is a leprous mark would be krum beitzah. So yomru, mikrum beitzah lumala tamei, umitzdarfim zeim zeh. Why didn't it just say krum beitzah is the outer limit? Anything darker than that is not leprous. And also, they combine according to their shade, right? They combine with whatever's closest to it. So Amar lo, so Rabbi Akiva says, fine. I'll give you a different explanation why the Mishnah went into the detail. What's the name of, right? What is baheret? What does it look like? And what's its toladot? And what's its name? And what does it look, right? What does the color look like? What was the reason? Lomar lecha kol kohen she'no baki bahen u'b'shmotehen eino ro'eh Negaim. If you're a Kohen and you're supposed to check the nega, but you don't even know what they're called by name, and you don't know, right? If you don't know them by name, you can't check Negaim. Okay, this is a teaching you something additional about the requirements for the Kohen. Now, notice what it said here. And this is how we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva said, Zola Malamizo, because Ilu misid hechal ulamala lo ka'amar. Umidelo amar le shma mina deshmiya le Rabbi Akiva de amar kulu lebahade se mitzdarf. It didn't say from sid haichal and from krum betza. Now here we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva didn't agree with our Mishnah and held by some other approach of the Zelam al Mizeh. And the reason is because the suggestion here, which theoretically Rabbi Akiva accepted, which is it could have just said from krum betza ulamala, because according to Rabbi Akiva, it's all about the shades. If it was important to separate it and everything goes with its own toladot, and then it does not zeh zeh, because it's not A, B, A1, B1, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, but it goes A with A1, B with B1, then it should have split it into 2 tracks. And it should have said that on the baheret side, it's from the seed and the mala, from the plaster, the limestone. And on the side of the se'et, it's from the krum betza ulamala, right? And then it would separate into 2 tracks. From the fact that it doesn't, it sounds like, and the way they're going to say it at the end is, kulu levahade seit mitzdarfin. Everything connects with seit, meaning everything can join with seit. Why is that? Because seit is number 2 on our list. So number 2, now let's just go through. Number 2 can join with number 1 because it's next to it. So seit and baheret can go together. Seit can go with the toladot baheret because it's also next to it in the list because that's A1, which is right next to B, right? The seed. And it can also combine with the last one because what do we learn? Because of the drasha, sapachat, it can even go with its own toladot. So it seems like that's what Rabbi Akiva holds, and that's definitely not like our Mishnah. That's Zolam Alamizel, and that would be his proof. But the Gemara says you can't necessarily derive it from here because why not? Dilma se'et v'toladita, baheret v'toladita. Maybe what it means to say is seit and its toladah, and baheret and its toladah, meaning the whole thing that we said about Rabbi Akiva is because he specifically said from krum and the krum betza ulamala, right? That meant that they're all, right? It goes in order because it didn't separate into 1 track and 2 tracks. But now they're saying maybe he really did mean 2 tracks. And what he meant to say is mikrum betza ulamala, and from the other, he just shortened his words. But what he really meant is in each track, there's a bottom one, right? And that's the outer limit. And maybe you can't really derive it from here, even though it does seem pretty clear you could derive it. But the Gemara suggests maybe it's not the most convincing and maybe you could reject it. Okay, so let's try another one. Elami de Rabbi Chanina. And what did Rabbi Chanina say? And we're going to go back to Rabbi Chanina later, and he's going to do a similar thing for the position that goes against the Rabbi Akiva, which is our Mishnah, but right now he's going to do it for Rabbi Akiva. De Amar Rabbi Chanina, Mashal de Rabbi Akiva lema davar domeh. If we want to create a mashal, a parable, we want to say, okay, let's give an example so you can visualize, I guess, right? If you're struggling with this, right? They were also struggling with it. It's not so easy to understand. These are they're just these names of things. It's hard to really visualize everything. So I'm going to explain to you this idea of Rabbi Akiva that everything can be combined with the one that's right next to it. So what's this like? Domeh la'arba'a kosot shel chalav. Echad naflo letocho shnei tipin shel dam, ve'echad naflo letocho arba tipin shel dam. Okay, we have 4 cups of milk. The first one, some blood dripped into it, 2 drops of blood. Then the next one, arba tipin shel dam, 4 drops of blood. And then echad naflu letocho shmoneh, one has 8 drops of blood, and echad naflu letocho 12 tipin. And the next one has 12. Some people say 16, which kind of makes sense because 2, 4, 8, 16 every time we multiply it by 2. Okay. In any case, whether it's 12 or whether it's 16, it's not so important for our purposes. Shekulam marot lovenhem. They're all considered shades of white because in the end it's milk, even though the milk is maybe reddish, but it's still called milk. But what? If you look at these 4 cups, there's gradations here. One has 2 drops, it's a little pinkish. One is a little more pinkish, right? And as you go along, they become redder and redder. Okay, they're still all called white, but there's gradations here. Now that sounds really like Rabbi Akiva, right? That's it. He says it's about the gradations. It's not about which came from what. So now the Gemara says, now I want to just remind you, and you might not even pay attention to this in the Psukim, But there's different types of leprous marks. Okay, we talked about baheret, we talked about se'et, to these different white leprous marks. But the Torah also speaks about leprous marks that are adamdamit, that have some red in them. They're white with some red. So now we're going to call those patich. Okay, that's the word they use to describe those. And chaluk is going to be the complete white ones. So what they're saying is this example that Rabbi Hanina gave for Rabbi Akiva maybe is talking about specifically the leprous marks that are adam dameh, that are the reddish ones, but not the ones that are completely white. Because here we're talking about gradations when it's affected by some outside color that's mixed in. That's different than maybe the complete white ones. And maybe what we're going to say right now is, I'll read it inside. Perhaps we can't prove it from here, because Rabbi Akiva bepatuch bechaluk mishamalei. Maybe when Rabbi Akiva said that, he was talking about the reddish ones, but not the ones that are completely white. Maybe the completely white ones, we don't need to go with this gradation theory. Now, if you want to say, why would we differentiate patuch, chaluk, right? Reddish, whitish. What's the difference? Maybe if we say already that there's gradations with the reddish ones, we would say in the same vein that there's gradations by the complete white ones. Well, and then to answer this, the Gemara says, but wait a minute. How do we even know that Rabbi Akiva holds there's gradations even in the patuch? And now we're going to bring a contradictory source. V'hatanya Rabbi Akiva omer, adamdam shebazeh v'shebazeh, ki yen hamazug b'mayim. Okay, the adamdam, this reddish tint that we have, is like wine that's diluted. Okay, meaning it's white, right? But it has wine in it. I'm going to say it's like diluted wine. Okay, what does this mean? It's like wine that drips into water, kind of thing. It gets poured into water. Ela shel baheret azak keshelek v'shel sid dehe hemenu. So here's the key. He says what's the difference? In other words, the adamdam shebazeh shebazeh. Okay, so now he's basically saying that. Just one second. Right. So what he's going to say, this last line is really what's problematic, because he says the baheret is white like snow, and the seed, the limestone, is darker than that. Now, I want you to think about this, okay? What he says in the beginning about the amdemet shebazeh and all that, he's basically saying, just one second. Right. Okay, he's saying Adam Dam. One. Right. What he's basically saying is, even in the reddish ones, we're going to go by, now I want you to pay attention. It sounds like he's saying we're going to go by the baheret and the seed, which is darker than that. Now I want you to remember, seed is what? It's the toladot of baheret. It's two away from baheret, which is weird, because Rabbi Akiva, the whole thing, you are now saying, even in the patich, because he's talking here about the reddish ones, he doesn't have zachar zeh. In other words, we were convinced that he had patich because of the language that Rabbi Hanina used to describe Rabbi Akiva. 2 drops of blood, 4 drops of blood, right? Gradation. And then we said, can we learn from the patich, though, to the chalak? To which we said, who even says you can learn it by the patich? Because here he's talking about the reddish. And yet he says that we look at these 2 colors, which 2 colors? Baheret and its toladot, which are 2 away from each other, because baheret is the closest to the se'et. How do we describe se'et? Remember, it's like the wool of the sheep. So they're going to say in Ita, if really you were right, turning out I'm a bet, that Rabbi Akiva goes by the gradations, then what it really should have said is, shel tzemer deha himenu mebayele. Should have said, and tzemer, remember we said it's like wool. It's like white wool, the se'et. That should be the one that's darker from it. Okay? So in other words, what he was saying here, let me just make it clear. The Adam Dammit ones, the ones that are reddish, shebazeh, right, with different gradations, are like yaim azug b'mayim. In other words, we still view it as what it was. It's a leprous mark with some reddish in it, and there's different shades. And he says, and how do they go together? Well, each one with its toladot. It's really what they're saying, not according to gradation, even in the reddish ones. So they say, no. Amrei inachinam. Okay, no, it's not really. Okay, they now say you're right. You can't really learn it from there. Okay. However, it's okay. you're right that that text is a problem, but we're going to bring a proof from a different text that maybe we could change the wording there. The Hatanya, it says in a Braita, Rabbi Natan Omer, Lo she'amar Rabbi Akiva shel sid dehehimenu, ela shel tzemer dehehimenu. Okay. So now we have it. We're going to change the wording there and say, no, Rabbi Akiva really said it is the wool that's darker from that. And then we end up, yes, proving it, at least by patich. Okay, it's still not clear if we can apply it also to the ones that are completely white, but at least by patich we have a solution. Not 100% clear that we would apply it necessarily to the white, but you could say that, and that's how we would have a source for Rabbi Akiva. Now, Minala, now the Gemara asks some other questions. Minala and the baheret azahi. How do you know that baheret is the most white one? Amar Abaye, Amar Krab, because look at the pasuk. Ve'im baheret levanahi. He levana ve'en acheret levana. Because it says levanahi, not just it's white, but levanahi, it is white, right? This leprous mark is white. Because it says this one is white, it's saying this one is white and not any other one is white, meaning it's whiter than all the others. Obviously, they're all white. Tanu Rabbanit, another thing about baheret. Baheret amuka, it's deep. And most of the commentaries think this means it appears to be deep. Appears to be deeper in your skin. Why is that? V'cheinu omer, you can see it from a pasuk, umar'eha amok min ha'ol. Okay, it says, the way it looks is deeper from the skin. Now they bring this drasha, or this analogy, it's like the sun, which is deeper than the shadow or than the shade. Okay, if you have something light, I don't know, you have to think about this. I don't really know enough about it. If you have some light, something next to a shadow, the light part will appear deeper. It'll appear lower down, even though they're really in the same place. Se'et. Now, why is it called se'et? Ain't se'et ela gava. Se'et, right? Laseit mashu is to carry it or to lift it up. So they're gonna say, ain't se'et ela gava. Se'et means it's higher, meaning the opposite of the baheret. The baheret looks deeper, that's lower. The se'et appears higher because it's not as light. V'cheinu omer, here's a proof from a pasuk also, that se'et means higher. This is taking, by the way, a noun of se'et and using it as if it's a verb or even an adjective. Describe something higher up. Okay, it's describing it. So, ein se'et el gavoa v'cheinu omer, al kol ha'arim aramim, and all the high mountains, v'al kol ha'gavaot hanisaot, right, and on all the mounds that are raised higher. Sapachat. What is the language of the word sapachat? Okay, we know this from the Hebrew language, and nispach, right, an area that was nispach is added on, like an annex. Ein sapachat ela tefillah. Tefillah is secondary, okay, because an annex is always secondary. V'cheinu omer, ve'amal sapchenina. Okay, but this is by Eli when he gets punished, or he gets this prophecy about how his family is going to be punished. They're going to say sapchenina, bring us in, okay, help us out. Okay, that's tefillah. Now let's go back. Remember we said, it said sapachat next to the word, right, next to the word se'et. Right? It said, o se'et, o sapachat, o baheret. So they said, the sapachat goes with the se'et, and that's how we learn that unique halacha, that even though, according to Rabbi Akiva, it's zeh chazeh, and each one is the one next to it only, can join, but you have a specific drasha by se'et and sapachat that they could join together. So now, right, then that's the se'et and its sapachat, which is the krum beitzah. So now the Gemara is going to say, eshkachan tefillah l'se'et, tefillah, but one other thing, besides that Rabbi Akiva had that special drasha there, but in general, it also teaches us that se'et has a sapachat, that se'et has a toladot. But we also know that baheret has a toladot. So eshkachan tefillah l'se'et, so I get why there's a toladot of se'et, because it says, l'se'et v'l'sapachat. But tefillah lebaheret minalan. How do we have a source that also baheret has a toladot, which we know because we saw it in our Mishna? Amar Rabbi Zera explains, Ne'amar levana b'se'et v'ne'amar levana b'baheret. Ma levana amura b'se'et yesh la tefillah, af levana amura b'baheret yesh la tefillah. The word levana appears both by the se'et, both by the baheret. So let's make a gzera shava. What's true for one is true for the other. So if there's a tefillah by the se'et, then there's also a tefillah by the baheret. That's one explanation. But this is an even better one, I think, a stronger one. B'manitatan, in a Braita, it gives a different explanation. Hitila katuv l'sapachat ben se'et lebaheret. They put In the pasuk, sapachat is right in the middle. Right? It says olas, right? Olas seit, olas sapachat, ola baheret. It's right smack in the middle of both of them. So, lomar lecha kashem shetfila leseit, kach tfila lebaheret. Okay, since there's a nispach for seit, there's also one, right? There's a toladot. There's also one for the baheret. So those are two different ways, either gzera shava or it's really both because it's right in the middle of them both. Se'ed kitsemer lavan. Se'ed is like white wool. My tsemer lavan. What white wool are we talking about? I mean, wool, white wool. Even there's many different shades of it. Amar vivi amar Ravasi. Semer naki ben yomo. They take the cleanest wool you could get, which is a 1 day old sheep. They shear it. Shemechabnin lo bo lemilat. It's the one that they take and they cover it and they protect it from getting dirty, and they use it to create a very fine wool. That's the color we're talking about. Okay, so that was a few side questions about the colors here and about the names and about some other drashot about them. Now we want to get back to, I told you we're going to see Rabbi Hanina gave a mashal also for the rabbis. The rabbis who broke it up into toladot and avot and not according to the shades and the gradations. So what's the mashal for them? So comes Rabbi Hanina and says, Amar Rabbi Hanina, mashal de Rabbanan lema davar domeh. Okay, so what's the mashal for the rabbis? Litdomeh litrei malchei ulitrei iparke. Malko shel zeh lemala mimalko shel zeh v'iparko shel zeh lemala miparko shel zeh. It's like two kings and they're two governors, okay? And then the way you have it is, right, the two kings are higher, right? One king is higher than the other. So we have a more important king, a less important king. And then the governor of the other is higher than the governor, right? One of the higher king's governor is higher than him. Okay, so that's the mashal. But the Gemara says, wait a minute. The way you just described it, right? There's a king and each one has a governor. But you just described it much more like Rabbi Akiva. It's like A, B, A1, B1, right? King, king, governor, governor. So the Gemara says, hi, that analogy sounds a lot more like Rabbi Akiva. Who? Ella, so fine. Let's say it like this. Ella malko shel zeh lemala mi'iparkei denafshe. Umalko shel zeh lemala mi'iparkei denafshe. What they're saying is each king is higher than its own governor. So we have two kings, and each king is higher than its own governor, but it's not comparing king, king, governor, governor, putting them in two separate lists, and that's much more like our rabbis. Here we're going to have a few other explanations, like analogies. Rav Adabra ba'amal kigom malka va'al kapta urufila v'resh galuta. Here, instead of saying two kings, right, we have like baheret and se'ed. They're two totally different things. I mean, they're not so different. They're both leprous marks. But let's say king and his al kapta and a rufila and the exilarch. Okay, we're not so familiar with these phrases, what they are exactly. I think the English was a vizier or something. Okay, there's I'm not sure if I'm even pronouncing it right, but there's maybe it's something else, I don't remember. But they're basically, there's different types of rulers. Okay, so this is one ruler with its subordinate, and this is a different ruler with its subordinate. But they say that is still because a malka and a kapta, right? Still, you're going to end up with this gradation. Okay, and perhaps what they're saying is there's the malka and the al kapta, and then the rufila and the resh galuta, or maybe the malka rufila al kapta resh galuta. In other words, you still end up with gradations according to this. So elakigom malka v'rufila val kapta b'resh galuta. They change it to say the malka and its rufila and the al kapta and the resh galuta. Okay, because they're saying, just 1 minute, let me just check one thing. I see the malka and the al kapta. I see. The malka and the al kapta are both like higher levels, and then the rufila and resh galuta are both lower levels. Like the rufila works for the king, and the resh galuta works for the al kapta. So that order, actually, the original order, malka al kapta rufila resh galuta goes 1, 2, 3, 4 really. So that's why it sounds more like Rabbi Akiva. But if you switch it to malka v'rufila, because the rufila works for the king, and the al kapta v'resh galuta, because the resh galuta reports to the al kapta, then that's much more organized, like the rabbi said in our Mishna. Rava gives a different example. Okay, you see, we keep reading examples. They're very similar. So we're going to see a totally different example from a different world, but we're all within this talking about rulers. Kigon Shavur Malka v'Kesar. Shavur Malka was the Persian king, and the Kesar was the Roman king. Okay, you want to learn more about the Persian king and Shavur Malka, you can read in Flashback this week. So we have Shavur Malka and the Kesar. And then underneath them, they each have their own, and then it's two totally different tracks. They have nothing to do with each other at all. So Amalei Rav Papa Rav Heminayu Adif. Which one is the higher? Because in all of this, right, the baheret and the seid, even if they're two different tracks, still one is whiter than the other, and that's clear. So in this example, who's the one who's a more prominent leader? To which Rava has a very interesting answer. Amar le, he says to him, he says, B'chor shaya ka'achile? Do you eat in the forest? Like, where do you live? Are you living hiding out in the forest so you don't even know what's going on in the world? Go look at which coin is accepted anywhere in the world. The Roman coin, obviously. The Romans were way bigger than the Persians. And he says, of course, the Roman king's more important. How do we know this? And he proves it actually from Pasuk. Dichtiv. Now, here we're talking about in these dreams, these visions that Daniel had, there were these four animals, and the fourth was the strongest and fiercest. And yet Daniel says that fourth one is going to be conquered. Vatochul kol ara v'tudashna v'tadokna. Okay, the whole land will be wiped out. It will be crushed up into, smashed down and crushed up into pieces. And Amar Rabbi Yochanan Zoromi. That is the Romans who in the end will have to be, will be destroyed. Why is Rome the fourth and the most important? Because their matbea is accepted everywhere, right? If your currency is accepted everywhere, that shows power, right? The fact that you can go almost anywhere in the world and use dollars. I mean, actually, it's weakened in years, and that's a sign of the weakening of the United States, actually. That you can't always go everywhere, right? It used to be we would travel and everywhere they would take dollars. Now I've been to places where they won't take dollars and you can only change it in a bank. It's actually really hard. That's kind of how things have changed. But it shows that they are the most powerful. Ravina Amar, okay, here's a different example. We're just getting a whole slew of examples, right? Rabbi Hanina started, then others went also, of comparisons here. So Ravina Amar, Kigon Galima de Amal Veshachke. First of all, we're always talking about, when we talk about different materials, it's always wool and linen. So here they're taking two examples, one a clothing of wool, and when it starts getting worn away and it's already not so light anymore, not so white, it gets darker. Or a sadin, a sheet of flax, of linen. And also, and it's toladot, is one that's already worn away and it's no longer that shiny white that it used to be. And that's another example of the way that, again, the analogy to the rabbis that split into these two categories and each one has its subcategory. Okay, so we saw many different ways to do it. Only the last one didn't really have to do with kings and rulers and that type. Okay, now we're going to finish up we're moving to a different topic completely. We're now back to the Mishna. We're saying, when do you bring this korban levi ored? If you knew before, you knew after that you were impure, but you forgot in the middle. So the Gemara is going to bring a braita, Tanu Rabbanan, which asks a very basic question. You might remember the pasuk, and the pasuk there said, right? You know you're tamei, and then you forget, and you're guilty. But it doesn't say what you did when you were impure. Maybe you ate truma, for example. Okay, how do we know that it's specifically eating sacrificial items or going into the temple? It doesn't say that anywhere in the psukim. So they say v'dinu. It's just logical. Ho'il v'yizhir v'anash ala tum'ah v'chiyev korban ala tum'ah. Makshi yizhir v'anash ala tum'ah lo yizhir v'anash el al tum'ah mikdash v'kodashav. Av k'shchiyev korban ala tum'ah lo chiyev el al tum'ah mikdash v'kodashav. Your theory goes like this. If you go into the temple, there's psukim that talk about it. If you go into the temple or eat kodashim, sacrificial meat, when you're tamei, you're going to get the death penalty of karet. Okay, there's different death penalties. There's mitabi de shamayim, which is less severe. Okay, death by the hands of God. And then there's karet, which is more severe. And karet, if you remember, they can give you lashes, according to most opinions, in the courts. Now, in general, the korban chatat, the sin offering, the regular sin offering, right? Remember, this is a korban levi ored, the sliding scale. And if you haven't listened to Alana Stein-Haynes, this is a good time to listen to it on the sliding scale offering, her shiur from this week. But let's just stop for a minute before we get there. the regular chatat sin offering is usually brought for something where if you were to do it intentionally, you would get karet, and therefore if you do it unwittingly, you'll bring a sacrifice, this sin offering. So now the rabbis are saying, well, what case of impurity and doing something impurity do you get karet for if you did it intentionally? Case of you knew you were tamei, you walked into the temple, or you ate sacrificial meat. Okay, if you eat truma, for example, you're going to get death by the hands of God, but you're not going to get karet, which is more severe. Now, because karet is usually associated with korban, and because we see here there's a korban for someone who's impure, but we don't know what the impure person did, we're going to connect the two and say, just like there's a korban, right? Just like there's karet for someone who does it intentionally, goes into the temple when they're impure, we're going to assume this korban is for someone who does that same thing unwittingly. And that's how they get to it, okay? So I'll read it inside again. They were psukim that basically said if you're impure and you go into the temple, you're going to get karet. And there's a pasuk that says you're chayav a korban for tuma, even though it didn't explain for doing what when you're impure. So maksh is here v'anash ala tuma, lo is here v'anash ala tuma mikdash v'kodashav, just like there in the karet case. You were warned specifically about going into the temple and eating sacrificial meat. So av keshechiyev korban ala tuma, lo chiyev ala tuma mikdash v'kodashav. So therefore, this korban is also just on that. So now the Gemara says, "Ve'ema truma." Why not truma though? She's here v'anash. Also, there's a warning. There's punishment of death. It's not karet, but it's death. So the answer, lo eshkachana v'mitad chayav korban. We don't have a case. Like, for example, the sin offering, I told you, it's karet. It's not, right? It's not for death by the hands of God. So Gemara says, wait, and we'll end with this. Korban kavua. You can't compare the sliding scale with the sin offering because the sin offering is a korban that's always the same, right? There is no sliding scale. If you're obligated chata, you have to bring an animal and the one that you're supposed to bring it, and there's no choice here. Okay, aval, but in this case, olav, it's already a weaker korban. So maybe the lighter korban can be brought for something that's only the death penalty, right? Death by the hands of God, right? Nate midi, right? Maybe you would bring it. And what's the proof? Because in the psukim there it says there's also cases like, for example, the Shevuot bitoy, right? Taking an oath and then lying about it, or not giving testimony. Those are cases where where there's no karet associated with it, and yet you bring the korban olev yored. So we see the korban olev yored as an exception, which opens the question, maybe it would apply for truma as well, even though we know it doesn't. So why not? We're going to be left with that question. So let's do a review of our daf. We started with the issue of the baheret and the se'et and the two approaches. We had the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, and we basically wanted to try to prove, number one, that our Mishna doesn't go with Rabbi Akiva. These are two totally different approaches. One goes toladot, the other one goes in order of gradation. Then we wanted to say, where does Rabbi Akiva say this issue of gradation? We brought two sources, although we couldn't prove it completely, but each one kind of did seem to say that, even though the Gemara rejected it. And then we had from there we had a few questions about the baheret, a few drashot on the baheret, on the se'et, darshaning the etymology of the words, some of them like the se'et and the sapachat, what they mean, and how we get that there's a toladot also of baheret if it doesn't appear next to it in the pasuk. Well, actually does appear next to it in the pasuk, so we saw two interpretations, either that or Xer Shava. And from there we moved to explaining what the tzemer lavan is, right? What kind of color is it? And then we went back to the mashal for the rabbis, and then we brought a whole bunch of different examples of kings and other things to explain this idea of av and toladot. And each toladot goes with its own av, but we don't look at it as gradations. And from there we ended with, how do you know that this issue of bringing a korban olev yored is specifically for someone who was tamei, who went into the temple or ate sacrificial meat unwittingly? How do you know it was who went to the temple and ate sacrificial meat? Maybe it was something else. Maybe, for example, like truma. So we'll deal with that in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a good day.